All right, questions for next week on Judges 9 are coming around to you now. And we are ready for Judges 8 in our study tonight. Judges chapter 8. So let's go back and see where we are, where we've been in our study. This is the outline we're following from Wiersbe, 3 major points as he outlines it. Apathy, apostasy, and anarchy. The apathy section dealt with the early victories, but they failed to drive out the people they should drive out, and consequently that created problems for them. And we're in the second section called apostasy, dealing with various judges. We are in the one dealing with Gideon, chapter 6 to 8, and we're finishing up Gideon. We're going back and review some things in 6 and 7 and finish with chapter 8 in just a few moments. We haven't looked at this each time, but this may make more sense to you than Wiersbe. This is Micah's outline of judges, the need for the judges, the work of the judges, and the time of the judges. I like that. The work of the judges, 3 to 16 is where we are. All right, this is the cycle. I said you'd look at it each time. You may get tired of looking at that, but this is exactly what God was seeing. He saw the people go into sin, and they fall into sin, and then God allows an oppressor to come, and then they cry out for deliverance, and God raises up a judge, and they are delivered, and then they serve the Lord for a period of time. And then they go through the cycle again, and then they go through the cycle again, and then they go through the cycle again. I've asked you to try to remember these judges in the order in which they are given in the text. And so we only have 5 to remember: Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, and Gideon. And some want to include with Deborah Barak. If you want to include him there, fine. But Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, and Gideon. And so the more we add to that, the harder it's going to get. All right, let's go back to chapter 6. Chapter 6, 7, and 8 go together as a unit of chapters dealing with Gideon. And I think some of that's going to be important to pick up some things in chapter 6 as we conclude at the end of chapter 8 here in just a few moments. So what happened in chapter 6? We call it the call of Gideon. What does chapter 6 tell us? What do we see in chapter 6, I guess? Maybe another way of wording that. Very good, very good. Good summary. It's exactly what goes on in chapter 6. So we see the picture of him early on in chapter 6. We might say he's timid, or it may be a sense of humility, or a sense of dragging his feet, that he seems to be an humble servant. Who am I to go do this? I'm not the man for the job. I don't know. He seems to be lacking courage and faith, but nonetheless he goes and God calls him to be the judge. But it's interesting that he didn't muster up this courage to go and deal with his father's idolatry, though he did it by night because he feared the father's household. But God keeps giving him assurance and assurance and assurance. So that leads to chapter 7 now. That was the call of Gideon, chapter 6. Chapter 7, Gideon's army fights the Midianites. What do we see in chapter 7? What do we remember? That's last week. Yeah, I kept reducing the number substantially until finally they're going to take on a large army with 300 men. And that's the number that we find by the time we get down to verse 7 and in verse 8. So Gideon's army was significantly reduced by thousands until finally they come down to 300. 9 through 14, assurance is given to Gideon. What happens in this section? All right. So he gets that assurance, and then he musters the courage to go, and they, with 300 men, they take their torches and their pitchers, and they break their pitchers, and what do they shout? Sword of the Lord and Gideon. And the chapter ends on the note of verses 15 through verse 25, and that is the battle. What happened in the battle? Yeah, mass confusion. They turned on themselves, and then they are in pursuit. Now that leads us to chapter 8. Question number 1 for tonight, a short summary of chapter 8. What was chapter 8 about, or what is it about? All right, Gideon's ephod. Yeah, that's good. He subdued the Midianites. I call this chapter simply Gideon delivers Israel from the Midianites. This is kind of the final chapter of the defeat of the Midianites. But what's interesting to me is, as one writer suggested, this is seemingly his what happens after the battle. And that's often the case. And let's make some parallel and application to us, that there's the battle that you may win, but then you may lose after the battle. We can fight a battle. Maybe it's on some error. Maybe it's a sin that we're dealing with in our own life. And you overcome that, but how do you deal with that victory following the battle may bring down your defeat? And we see that with reference to Gideon. The battle went well, but it's how he handled things after the battle that didn't go so well. And we're going to see that in chapter 8. So here's what happens in chapter 8. He's rebuked by the men of Ephraim in verses 1 to 3. And then we see that he's rejected by the men of Succoth and Phanuel. He's rejected by their help, that is. They rejected any offer to be of help to Gideon and his 300 men. Then we have Gideon pursuing, and he killed Zebah and Zalmunna. And we'll look at the details of that in a moment. And then we have Gideon's ephod and Gideon's death, and that's the end of the story of Gideon. And then we're ready to go into his son's leadership, starting in chapter 9. Abimelech. All right, let's go to question number 2. What was Ephraim's rebuke? Yeah, they weren't asked to help. Why didn't you take us with you? And so let's look at verses 1 to 3. That the men of Ephraim said to him, "Why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites?" And they reprimanded him sharply. In other words, this wasn't just an inquiry of hey, we'd have been glad to go with you if you'd have asked, but we wished you'd ask us to go. But they're upset about this. They rebuke him sharply over that. And so why are they rebuking him? Well, there seems to be some tribal jealousy, a petty kind of tribal jealousy. Over what? Well, I don't know. It's very likely that there's more involved in this than that we didn't just get to help. One writer suggested, and there's some conjecture here, that it may be they missed out on the spoils. The spoils were quite large in the conquering of over 100,000, as we're going to see a little bit later in making the ephod. And so it may be that as they went into battle, if you'd asked us, we'd have got some of those spoils. And we didn't get some of the spoils, and we're upset about that. So why did you go to battle without us? And maybe don't mention the spoils. Same writer suggests that there are times when people criticize, and behind that there is a personal reason behind all of that criticism. That they're criticizing you for one thing, but there's another thing eating at them over here. And that may be what's going on with reference to Ephraim. That they're upset because they didn't get the spoils. I don't know. But be that as it may, what was his response in verses 2 and 3? There seems to be a little bit of an ego thing. And then let's talk first about what his answer was, what their reaction to the answer, and then how do I know it was seemingly an ego thing? Let's go in that order. What did they What did he say to them? Yeah. What you did was far of greater significance than what I've done. Yeah, we went to battle, but he said, what have I done in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? The gleaning of the grapes, if you have a footnote, it'll suggest this, the few grapes left over after the harvest. And the vintage would be the whole harvest. And so he's saying, the little bit that you think you did is of greater significance than the whole harvest that I did. And he expands upon that. Look at verse 3. God delivered into your hand the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you? In other words, you took two significant leaders, two significant kings that we were routing through this battle, and you took care of those. And what I accomplished, what is that in comparison to what you've done? What was their reaction to that? In other words, you accomplished far more in what little you did than was accomplished over here in the great things that I may have accomplished. And they said, or what was their reaction? Not what they said, but their reaction was, they calmed down. Now, why would I say that it seems to be a little bit of pride, or that's the word I'm looking for? I guess pride. Why would I say it seems to be a problem with pride? Well, okay. Yeah. Yes, I have. Yeah. And so that does seem to satisfy them rather than saying, no, we wanted to be a part of the battle. We wanted to make sure we were fighting for the cause of the Lord. Their pride seems to be in their way. And now it's interesting, here Gideon as a leader, we're going to see some faults of Gideon toward the end. We've already seen faults in chapter 6. We're going to see faults at the end. But Gideon is leading in the right direction of defeating the Midianites, but at the same time he's trying to fight this battle. He's got problems that he has to deal with from the inside. And that is, he's got to deal with his own tribe, his own brethren among the Ephraimites. Then he's going to have to deal with Succoth and Penuel. He's got to deal with other problems that are creating some headache for him along the way. All right, let's go to verses 4 through 9. He is rejected by the men of Succoth and Penuel. Let's get that on the map as to where that is, and then we'll come back to the flow of those verses. Last week we talked about, to get your bearings, this is the Dead Sea down here, and then this is the Jordan River going up to the Sea of Galilee. This is where the battle takes place, and the men were in the battle, Gideon drove them down to Beth-bara, and then across the river over here in the tribe of Gad is Succoth right here, and Penuel, or Peniel, I think some pronounce that. And that's as he comes across that way, pursuing after two of the kings of the Midianites that we're going to talk about. He's pursuing them down in this direction, and we're going to go further on another map with reference to that. So when he comes to Succoth, that's the first one he comes to. Beginning at verse 4, he brings 300 men, he crosses over the river. What's their condition as they cross over the river? Exhausted. Yeah. And what does he ask these men of Succoth? Yeah. How about give us these loaves and these men who follow me? How about giving us loaves of bread? Look at verse 5. Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they're exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. And so, yes, we're trying to defeat the Midianites, and there's kings that escaped, and we're after them. I'm pursuing them. I'm after them. I'm going to go get them. Then give us a little support along the way. And their answer was, I'm sorry? Yeah. Have you defeated them yet, basically, is the question. And are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hands that we should give you bread? What do you make of that? Yeah, that's the fear of rebellion. I mean, not rebellion, but retaliation is why they're rebelling, that seemingly rebelling that way. That no, we're not going to support you, because if we give you support and you go and you're not successful in that, then they're going to come back and get us. So we don't want to be supportive of you. Now, if you had them in your hands and you'd already killed them and you've got them captured, then we'd be glad to support you. There's a practical lesson in that. We'll hold that to a little bit toward the end. But there is something very practical in that. They at this juncture, though, I just want to notice, they seem to fear retaliation. So he goes to the next city, Penuel. And what happens there? Same thing. If you've killed them, then we'll support you. If you've captured them, we'll support you. You ain't captured them yet. No support, no bread, no food. I know you're exhausted, but go on your way. Then what did Gideon say? Well, what did he say? First of all, I skipped verse 7. What did he say to the men of Succoth? Yeah, I'm going to give you a whooping when I get back. What he said, isn't it? I'm going to teach you something when I come back. I'm going to go do my job. I'm going to do my work. I'm coming back. And I'm going to take the thorns of the wilderness with the briars, and I will tear your flesh. Now, what does that mean? Well, we'll talk more about that when we get to his actual performance thereof at verse 16, what some of the options may be. But that's his threat to them. I've got a job. I'm going on. I'm going to do my work, but I'm coming back, and I'll take care of you when I get back. So then he goes to Penuel, and they did the same thing. What did he say to them? Verse 9. I'm going to tear down your tower. Now, there's a question raised at this juncture. Why did he's got some opposition from Ephraim, and he's got some opposition from Succoth and Penuel. And these are brethren. And we'll raise a question about that, but just stop and picture for a moment. This reminds me of the days of Nehemiah, that there was not only problems from the outside, but there were problems from the inside. Nehemiah had to stop and deal with the mistreatment of brethren while he's trying to build the wall, and he has threats from Tobiah and Sanballat and Tobiah to the north and to the south, and then here's all the problems within he's dealing with. Well, Gideon's doing the same thing. Gideon's trying to fight a battle, and at the same time, he's the main leader among God's people, and he's got to deal with Ephraim and their complaint. He's got to deal with Succoth and their rebellion, and he's got to deal with Penuel and their rebellion. It's not enough to be fighting, but he's got to deal with all the problems with him. But here's one of the questions that comes up. Why did he deal with Ephraim different than he did these cities? And why did he deal with these different? In other words, at Ephraim, when they bring a complaint to him, they go, he reasons with them, and that takes care of that. And yet when these raise this question about, we're not going to do that unless you've already got them, he promises to come back and kill them. Why the difference? Why didn't he reason with them? He is losing patience. And I don't blame him. You're right. One writer suggested that with Ephraim, Gideon was dealing with a personal insult, where here, with these two, he's dealing with rebellion. There's a difference in somebody being insulted or hurling insults at you, or being upset, or their pride's in the way, and in them rebelling against the cause of the Lord. And another writer suggests the idea that leaders need to learn from that how to deal with various people. You don't deal with everyone in the same way. The person who is weak, who can be encouraged, you don't deal with in the same way you do with a rebellious person. There's quite a bit of difference in those. And so Gideon, did he deal with them rightly? Apparently so. He dealt with Ephraim by reasoning with them and with softer approach than he did with these two who seem to be rebelling against the cause of the Lord. We're not going to support the defeat of the enemy unless we know it's going to really happen. So they showed a lack of faith, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, let's start now at verse 10. Let's go back to our outline, and we'll come back to maps a little bit later. Now, let's talk about verses 10 through 21. Pursued and killed, That is, Gideon pursued and he killed Zebah and Zalmunna. And three things happen here. First of all, he pursued and captured Zebah and Zalmunna. And let's see what happens in 10 through 14. Now, Zebah and Zalmunna were at Kerkar. Well, let's see if we can find that on the map to kind of give us a little bit of bearing. This is, that's not what I wanted. Here we go. We'll blow this up a little bit here. Let me do that. Let me first get your bearing here. This is the Jordan River, and right at the top up here is this is the Sea of Galilee. This is where the battle started. And right here is Succoth and Penuel. And they're making their way down through over to Kerkar, which is down in this direction. It's going to be further down toward the Midianites, is where we're headed. Now, let's see what happens in 10 through 12. They were at Kerkar, which is down in their home area, down toward Midian. And about 15,000 men were left of the army, because how many had been killed? 120,000 who drew the sword had been killed. And so how did he capture them? Yes. And I'm looking for a phrase here. What's verse 11? That Gideon went up. At the end of verse 11 is what I'm looking for. That he went up by the road of the tents of Nobah and Jogbehah, and he attacked the army there while they felt secure. Apparently at night when they're sleeping. Now here's the. You may not can see this on right here, but here is Jogbehah, and then the other city mentioned there is right close by, about where my arrow is. So in other words, he pursued them from Succoth and Penuel, having dealt with the conflict there, comes on around to Jogbehah, and then headed down to Kerkar, or Karkor, I think is how that's pronounced. And that's where he's headed. And then he says, the text says at verse 12, that when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and took the kings and routed the whole army. Somebody have the English Standard at verse 11. Doesn't use the word routed. I think it's confused the army, is it? Who has English Standard? End of verse 11. Attacked. End of verse 12. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah, threw him into a panic. That's what I remember. In other words, he threw him into confusion and to a panic. He's routing the army, but threw them into panic. That's what happened in chapter 7, is the point I want you to see. So he pursued them and he's captured these two kings. Now, he hadn't killed them yet. So now he goes back and he deals with, now that he's captured the kings, he's got them in his hand. He's not in hot pursuit. He goes back and deals with Succoth and Penuel. So let's see what happens in 13 to 17. When he came back, he caught a young man. What information did he get from the young man when he came to Succoth? Write down the princes and the elders and the leaders of the city. I want to know who they are. How many were there? Yeah. And he wrote the names down, 77 men. And when he came to Succoth, he presented them and said, here are the men. Do you get kind of a feeling that he's kind of, I told you I was going after them. I told you I was going to do this. I told you you should have supported me. But here are these men over which you, I'm paraphrasing verse 15, ridicule me saying, are they in your hands, that we should give you bread? And these are the men that you said, if they are in your hands, I'll give you bread. You ridicule me over that. Here they are. I've got them. I've caught them. Here they are. Now verse 16, what did he do with them? He did exactly what he said he would do. He tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. Now, what does that mean? I think probably it means he killed them. Some think that means he just gave them, the men of Succoth, that he gave them a good thrashing with briars and thorns, and that the men of Penuel he killed. I think he probably may have done it with thorns, which he said he was going to do, but he probably means he killed both groups of men, that is, men of both cities. But what's interesting, at the end of verse 16, it says, he taught the men of Succoth. He taught them. What a lesson. You think you know anybody needs to be taught like these men? The footnote will say he did what? Disciplined them. It might have resulted in their death. That's a question. Go back again, verse 16 and 17 together. Verse 16 says he took the men of the city and the thorns of the wilderness and the briars, and with him he taught the men of Succoth, and then he went and tore down the tower of the men of Penuel and killed them. Now the word killed is not used with reference to Succoth, but probably implies that. And so students question, at verse 16, was that just a good thrashing? But he killed these other men? I don't know. Or did he thrash them and then it resulted in their death, and then he went and killed these men and tore down their tower? I'm not sure. But he taught them. Now there's a practical thing to learn from that. That discipline, even if this was greatly severe discipline, was a teaching tool. He taught them. And at least before they died, they learned they should have supported. They should have given him bread. It is a teaching tool. Maybe a little late, but it's a teaching tool nonetheless. All right, let's catch up on our questions here that we probably should have already asked. Question number 3. Let's go back to verses 4 to 9. What did Gideon say to the men of Succoth and Penuel? Or Peniel? I'm going to come. He asked for bread to eat, but he told them, I'm coming back and I'm going to tear your flesh and I'm going to tear down your tower. Who were Zebah and Zalmunna? Zalmunna, rather, not Salmonah. That's a typo. Kings of Midian. These were various kings. At this particular time and through the book of Joshua, often there were kings of a city or a group of cities sometimes, and not just a king of a whole region, as we would think in our own present day. Now, we'll come back to our questions in a moment. Let's talk about him killing Zebah and Zalmunna in verses 18 to 21. What did he ask them at verse 18? What kind of men did you kill at Tabor? Now, when that took place, we're not told. Apparently, this had happened and this had gone on for some years of the raids of the Midianites coming in to the children of Israel. And one of the previous raids that they had come in, they had taken care of some men of Tabor, which were the brothers of Gideon. And he doesn't identify that just yet, but he will in just a minute. But what kind of men were they that you killed? Apparently, these are war crimes that they've been that Gideon is dealing with. Is Gideon doing the right thing in trying to execute judgment against them? We're going to come back to what their answer was in a moment, but that he's going to take it on himself to go and execute judgment. Was there anything in the law of Moses about that? Yeah, there was a time to do that, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But Numbers 35, I'm not going to take the time to turn there. Numbers 35 talks about the family was to have an avenger to go after one who had done wrong or had killed someone in the family. The family was to send an avenger, and that's why then there would be cities of refuge so that you're fleeing from the avenger. Remember that? So he was within his right to deal with this problem. But what's interesting is their answer. He said, what kind of men were that you killed over there at Tabor? And their answer was, they resembled the son of a king, a prince. In other words, the men I killed over there looked like the sons of the king, like a princess. What kind of like you? What do you think they're doing? Flattering him, exactly. They're flattering Gideon. You think you've just been captured by a man who's probably going to kill you, and he's questioning and interrogating you. What about that murder you committed back over yonder and killed some men? What were they like? Well, looked like princely men, kind of like you do. They seem to want to flatter him, perhaps thinking that they may escape by flattering him. Well, Gideon doesn't fall for it. He doesn't fall for the flatter. He said, they were my brothers, the son of my mother, verse 19, and as the Lord lives, and if you had let them live, I would not kill you. In other words, I am going to kill you. Now, verse 20. Who is Jether? And what was he told? Go ahead, Stephen. Yeah, Gideon's firstborn, who's still young. Quite young, in fact, verse 20 suggests. And what does Gideon say to him? Won't you rise and kill him? Now, why does he have his son do that, or ask his son to do that? The text doesn't actually say. Could be a test of him. Could be humiliation of, we're going to see it a little later, I believe it's in the next chapter, where one didn't want to be killed by a woman. That's humiliating. You think of being a king, and it's one thing to be killed by another king, but to be killed by some youth. And perhaps that was the height of humiliation. That I'm gonna let my son kill you. I'm gonna let this young boy kill you. I'm gonna let this youth kill you. Further humiliation of them. Maybe that's some conjecture. I recognize that. So buy it or reject it as you see fit. Well, what was his reaction when he was told to do that? Yeah, they said do it yourself, but before that, what did Jether do? Yeah. He would not draw the sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. He was young. This is a big thing. This is a big challenge. He wasn't ready for it. Wasn't ready to jump in the saddle yet. Now, verse 21, so the two kings said, rise yourself and kill us, for as a man is, so is his strength. In other words, let's see if you got the strength to do it. He can't do it. He's just a youth. So do you have the strength? As a man is, so is his strength. So are you strong enough to do it? Well, they have to know he's going to do that. And so why did they do that? I don't know. The text doesn't say, but some have suggested maybe, and there is some conjecture here, that they didn't want to be humiliated by the youth killing them, so we're going to be killed. We know we'd rather you do it than them. And others have suggested, though it is highly a matter of conjecture, that they thought Gideon had experience at killing and it would be less pain than involved with a young man who may not do too good first try, and it may be a painful, slow death. So you go ahead and you kill us. And so he arose and he killed him. It seems like, as Ricky mentioned a moment ago, his patience ran out earlier. His patience is running out now. And he rises and he kills. And then they take the ornaments from them. And so that's the end of that story. Now we come to Gideon's ephod. And I want to get to this because I want to have time for some practical things. Let's get 22 to 28. What happens in 22 to 28? All right, very good. All right, let's work through that. It's a lot in that section. Yeah, we want to make you king. Now stick this in the back of your mind. We're going to come to this in a moment, and we're going to list some practical things. Stick this in the back of your mind. Here's an attitude already flaring up that we're going to see come in the day of Samuel. What happens in the day of Samuel? We want a king. Give us a king like the other nation. That wasn't the beginning of that. There was an attitude that started much, much earlier. Don't forget that principle. So, in practical application, there may be attitudes you see begin to pop up and you don't see much from that, and it pops up again and you don't see much from it. Watch those attitudes may come to fruition down the line and cause big issues, big problems. In the church, that happens with doctrine. It happens, attitudes toward one another. And so here's something pops up, but it's not a big deal at this point. It's kind of tamped down. It may come to be fruition later, and it did in this case. They're going to want a king a little later. Stick that in the back of your mind. That's important. But it's interesting what Gideon said, that I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you, but the Lord shall rule over you. What a powerful statement he made. No one can take the place of the Lord. I want to tell you, that was good talk. But the things that happened after that, he said, I'm not going to be your king. But then he turned around and he lived like a king. Exactly what he did. And I need to go back and double check, but I think I'm right in this, that Abimelech, he named his son Abimelech, which means son of a king. I think I'm right about that. You can check that and see if I'm right. So he says, I'm not going to be your king. But then he turns around and acts like a king. He took on a priestly role. He's not a priest. He made an ephod. Now, why did he make the ephod? Well, seemingly, when he took all the gold and from the spoils, and I'm not going to be your king, but I will take the gold that you. Well, okay, then we'll do that because you've led us in this battle. And they bring all their gold, and he makes this ephod and sets it up in his city, his home city, where he's from, and Ophrah. And why did he do that? Well, verse 27 doesn't exactly tell us. It may be that he intended to set it up as a trophy of war. Others have suggested he set this ephod up as a means, which an ephod was part of the priestly garment on which they put the Urim and the Thummim to consult with God, and it may have been an effort to help them in their worship. And seemingly it was some means of trying to help the children of Israel. He seems to be trying to do the right thing. Do something good, do something beneficial. Either a reminder of the war, I'm not going to be your king, but I'll take the gold and I'll make a trophy of the war and remind you of our victory. Or I'm trying to help you in your worship. Whatever it was, he says, I won't be your king, but he starts downhill. And notice verse 27, it became a snare to them. How did it become a snare to them? They made basically an idol out of that. They played the harlot with it. And so there was peace and quiet, and they subdued the Midianites so that there is no more oppression from the Midianites. That's the end of the Midianite oppression. Now, there's not the end of problems. Let's talk about Gideon's death, and then we'll have some time, hopefully, for some practical things here in the last 4 or 5 minutes. What do we learn in 29 through verse 35, other than he died? We know he died. He had 70 sons. He dwelt in his own house. This is kind of his retirement here. He had 70 sons, had one concubine, and from that concubine he had a son whom he named Abimelech. That's our next judge, chapter 9. Lived into a good old age, and he died, and he buried with his father. And what happened now at verse 33? Testimony to his own failure. Cycle starts all over again. Verse 34, the children of Israel did not remember the Lord, who had delivered them from the hand of all their enemies from every side. It didn't take them long till they had forgotten all about God. And if they'll forget about God, they're going to forget about something else. Verse 35, what are they going to forget about? Gideon. Absolutely. Nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done. You think of all the good he did, and they forgot all about him. So don't ever think you're going to do such good that people are going to remember you 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. They probably won't. They'll forget all about any of us. will be long forgotten. Testimony to that, there have been men who have led in battles who fought great victories over institutionalism or other battles, who, as soon as the battle's over, people forgot all about him. They didn't know who he was. Had no clue. I lived in the Louisville area in the 1980s, and when some of you remember A.C. Grider, he preached out here at Eastside. There's not a church in the Louisville area. Louisville is like Birmingham and Tampa. There are more non-institutional churches there than there are institutional groups. It's one of the few places in the country that's true. And of the 15 or so churches in the Louisville area, there's not a single one of them that didn't exist because, let me reword that, every one of them existed because of the work of A.C. Grider somehow. He either started it or helped start it, or it split off from a church that he had started. Every church owed its existence there somehow to his work. And when he died, we were in a building of 400 people, and only 115 people showed up. And a handful, about 5 people from the church where he was a member, showed up for the funeral. They didn't remember who he was. They forgot all about him. If they forgot about Grider, they're going to forget about me and you. Does that make sense? They couldn't remember anything Gideon had done. All right. That's kind of a sad note, but that's exactly what happens in history. All right. Now I want to get to some practical things here. Let's get over to my practical page and let's learn some things here. We don't have time for all of these, so let's hit the high points. Number 2, there are times when men should be thanking others for what they did and they criticize instead. That happened with Ephraim. Gideon didn't have time, number 4, for petty issues when he was fighting to defend the cause of God. Here's this petty issue. Why didn't you take us so we could go and fight in that? He didn't have time for that. Y'all did more than I did, and he goes on with his battle. We don't have time for petty issues when we're trying to defend the cause of God. Notice number 5, there are those who refuse to help unless it benefits them. Succoth and Penuel. If he'll help us, we'll go fight. But I'm more interested in number 6. There are those who refuse to help unless they know the outcome. Have you already got these men caught? Oh, yeah, well, then we'll help you. Oh, you haven't caught them yet? Not unless we know the outcome. They didn't have faith. They were lacking in faith. There's some who don't want to get on the bandwagon until they know the outcome. They want to know the outcome. They don't have faith. Number 7, we're taught by discipline. We see that at verse 16, verse 17. Number 8, we talked about the desire for a king is an attitude that will come to surface much later on. They're saying, we'll make you king, and no, I'm not going to be king. There's no king but God, and God will be your only king, And so that tamped down for now. We're not done with that attitude. That attitude's going to come back later. So don't be surprised when you hear somebody rise up with an attitude that they want to go in that direction, and it's tamped down. They're not through. They may be pushing that direction again. And so we got to watch for that attitude to surface again, because they're headed in that direction even again, and that may be the direction everybody goes. Number 10, men are prone to want to do things that lead to praise. That there seems to be some pride involved in verses 1 to 3. And I want to get verse 27, and then I want to make one other point, and then time is going to be gone. At verse 27, good intentions can go in the wrong direction. Whatever this ephod was for, whether it's a trophy of war or help them in their worship, seemingly Gideon had good intentions, but it went south after that. A lot of things are intended for man's good, and we intend for it to help, but it ends up bringing down destruction. And one other thing I want to notice, and then we're going to stop, that Gideon in chapter 6 started out as an humble servant, and now he's acting like a celebrity toward the end. Isn't that interesting? I don't think I'm the man for the job, and now he's living the life of a king, though he refuses to be a king. That's interesting. He starts out as an humble servant and ends up living like a celebrity. Chapter 9 next time, Abimelech.